I've spent weeks collecting and analyzing every new card release from the past 5 years in the TCG to answer one big question. Is Yu-Gi-Oh! All about anime nostalgia these days? Does the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters really get all the attention compared to the other shows? And how many anime-inspired cards are we getting compared to completely new ones? First, I'll break down how I collected and organized the data, explaining some of the key decisions along the way. Then I'll review my findings, starting with the top 10 characters who received the most support, followed by a rankings of all the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series based on how much support cards they got. Finally, I'll wrap up my overall thoughts on what this data really tells us, like how many anime nostalgia cards we got compared to completely new ones. And now, without any further ado, let's get started.
Alright, before we get into the rankings, I want to explain how I categorize and quantified anime and character support. Because as I quickly realized during my research, there's a lot of gray area when it comes to defining anime-based support. Some decisions were straightforward, but others required more interpretation. For example, what exactly counts as anime support and what doesn't? If an archetype was used by multiple characters, how should that be counted? And what about cards that appeared in the manga but not in the anime? A lot of this is open to interpretation, so while I did my best to categorize everything as accurately as possible, the numbers I'll be presenting are just my findings, not an absolute 100% definitive answer. I'm pretty knowledgeable about all of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime series, but with so many characters and cards to track, there's always a chance of a labeling mistake or an oversight in categorization. That said, I've made every effort to ensure the data is as accurate as possible. If you want to skip straight ahead to the top 10 characters who got the most support, you can jump ahead to the next chapter. I'll put the timestamp on screen and in the description. With Yu-Gi-Oh! Spanning 6 different anime series and many different manga, the franchise has built up a massive roster of characters. So for this analysis, I only included characters who appeared in the anime. However, if a new card was printed from the manga and belonged to a character who also appeared in the anime, I did count it towards that character's total. For example, Motor Frenzy never appeared in the anime, but Bandit Keith used it in the manga, so I counted it as Bandit Keith support. On the other hand, characters who only appeared in the manga were not included. There are also a few characters who appeared in multiple shows. To keep things simple, I categorized each character based on the first show they appeared in. Some cards clearly reference the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime but aren't tied to a specific character. The Duel Academy field spell is an obvious reference to Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, but not to a specific character, so I labeled it as generic GX support. When ranking the top 10 characters, I looked at the number of individual cards directly tied to each character. When ranking the Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, I added up all the character support from a given show, plus any generic cards tied to that series. Token encounters were not counted toward character support. Alternative artworks of existing cards were not included in the totals. And I used Yugipedia and the Yu-Gi-Oh! Wiki as my main sources for compiling this information. To set a fair starting point, I began my analysis with Toon Chaos, which was released in June 2020. This was the first set released after Eternity Code, the final core set tied to Yu-Gi-Oh! VRAINS. My reasoning was that if I started with a set that was still based on the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, it could have skewed the results in favor of that particular show. That was just my assumption, but it could be an interesting topic to research in the future to see if it holds true. Alright, now that we've established the criteria, let's dive into the top 10 characters who received the most support over the last 5 years. Kicking things off at number 10, we have Kite Tenyo, the main rival from Yu-Gi-Oh! ZEXAL. Most of his new support was introduced in the Photon Hypernova booster set, which even featured his new boss monster on the cover. Additional cards continued trickling in across a few more sets during this period. But what really helped Kite edge out 2 other characters and secure the 10th spot was the fact that he finally received some long-awaited cards from his appearance in Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5. Overall, Kite has been very well supported, and the fact that he's one of the few characters who appear in 2 different shows definitely worked in his favor. The Brothers of Legend set introduced these Arc 5 cards, further solidifying his place on this list. Next we have a tie at 20 support cards each, placing 2 main protagonists in the 9th and 8th spots. Yusei Fudo and Yuya Sakaki. Most of Yusei's support came from 2 main sets, Dawn of Majesty and Duelist Nexus, with a few additional cards scattered across other releases. There were also some cards that I felt were open to interpretation when it came to categorization. For example, I counted Shooting Star Dragon TGEX as a Yusei card. While the Shooting Star Dragon part clearly belongs to him, the TG in its name suggests a connection to Antinomy, another 5D's character. However, I ultimately classified it as Yusei support, because its artwork closely resembles Yusei's Synchro Dragons, and its effect follows the design style of others Yusei focused cards. Most of Yuya's support came from Dimension Force and Battles of Legend Monsters Revenge, each contributing 5 new cards. Dimension Force also introduced the first ever Ritual Pendulum monster. In addition, a few more cards were released across other products. There were also a couple of cards that also had connections to other characters, but were categorized as Yuya support due to how they functioned in practice. Odd Eye's Rebellion X Siege Dragon has ties to Yuto, but Yuto never used Pendulum monsters, so I decided to treat this as a Yuya card. Similarly, Odd Eye's Winged Dragon has a connection to Yugo, but I categorize it as Yuya support as well. Speedroids can't reliably summon this monster because it requires a Dark Tuner, which Speedroids don't have, and many Speedroids effects lock you into summoning only Wind monsters, while this card is Dark. Now from number 7 onward, things get really interesting. The next 3 characters are all tied at 21 support cards each, which is absolutely insane. Because of this, they share the 7 to 5 spots, but I'll go through them one by one. First up, we have none other than Joey Wheeler. And the main reason Joey ranks so high on this list is because Konami released dedicated Flame Swordsman support last year. Without those new cards, he wouldn't have even come close to the top 10. He'd be somewhere between 25 and 30 instead. The rest of Joey's support was scattered across multiple sets over the years. One of the toughest categorization decisions I faced was what to do with Red Eye's support. When I personally think of a Red Eye's duelist in the anime, my first thought is Atticus Rhodes, who actually played more of a dedicated Red Eye's deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. Meanwhile, Joey's deck plays more like a warrior good stuff deck that just happens to include Red Eye's Black Dragon. However, after reviewing the Red Eye support cards, including some of the most recent ones, it became clear that many of them were directly inspired by Joey Wheeler. So ultimately I decided to count Red Eye support toward Joey instead of Atticus. Next, also tied at 21 support cards, we have Yusaku Fujiki, the main protagonist of Yu-Gi-Oh! VRAINS. The majority of Yusaku's support came from the Cyberstorm Access core set, which released in May 2023. Aside from that, additional support cards have been introduced gradually across multiple other sets over the past few years. Just like with other characters, there were a few cards that could be categorized differently depending on your viewpoint. I categorize Rocket Coder as Yusaku support rather than Revolver support. It could be considered Revolver support since it can be treated as a dragon for the link summon of a Boral monster. However, I ultimately categorize it as Yusaku support because its design resembles a Code Talker monster more than a rocket. It's a Cyber's monster which aligns more with Yusaku's deck, and as far as I know, it has never actually been used in a Rocket Dragon Link deck. Link Into the VRAINS could arguably be labeled as generic Link VRAINS support. But since Yusaku is literally on the artwork, I counted it towards his total. Now on to number 5, and I have to admit, I was shocked this character made the top 10. Chaz Princeton. Not only that, but he even beat out multiple main protagonists while tying with Yusaku and Joey Wheeler. There are 2 main reasons why Chaz ranks so high on this list. Over the last few years, Konami released a significant amount of support for the Armed Dragon archetype, mainly in 2021's Blazing Vortex. A couple of Chaz's manga exclusive cards were released in a Battles of Legends set. Then in last year's Infinite Forbidden, Konami even created new cards for his manga deck, which was built around Light and Darkness Dragon, a completely different strategy from what he used in the anime. The fact that Chaz can draw from 2 completely different archetypes for support gives him a little bit of an edge compared to other characters, making the number 5 on this list. Coming in at number 4, we have another one of the main rivals, the one and only Seto Kaiba. But his spot in the top 10 wasn't as secured as some might think. Without the new structure deck that was just released, Kaiba wouldn't have even made the list. Thanks to those new cards, he now sits at 22 support cards, just 1 card ahead of the previous 3 characters. Like with some of the other characters, categorizing Kaiba support required some interesting decisions. One debate was to whether categorize the ABC XYZ Union support as Kaiba or Chaz support. There's actually more Union support coming soon, which already has been released in the OCG for months. Ultimately, I counted these cards toward Kaiba because many of the new cards seem to be more inspired by Kaiba rather than Chaz. Another question was whether to count Obelisk related support toward Kaiba or Yugi. After the events of Battle City, Yugi owns all 3 the Egyptian gods, So you could argue that Obelisk support should count for him. However, Yugi barely used Obelisk after acquiring it. Meanwhile, some of the new cards, like Soul Crossing, seems to be directly inspired by Kaiba's moments with Obelisk in the anime. Because of this, I ultimately counted these cards toward Kaiba. Now, kicking off the top 3. I have to say I was shocked when I saw who ended up in this spot. It's actually Yuma Tsukumo, the main protagonist of Yu-Gi-Oh! ZEXAL. I genuinely did not expect this. Before collecting and analyzing all of this data, my initial feeling was that Yuma was the one main character who hadn't been really getting much support lately. And in my defense, most of his support came in the first half of these 5 years. Outside of a few one-off support cards sprinkled in across different sets, almost all of Yuma's major support came from 2 key releases. Lightning Overdrive, which released back in June 2021, and Brothers of Legend released a little bit later that same year. In total, Yuma ended up with 25 support cards, securing his spot at number 3. And now for number 2, this was, without a doubt, the most surprising result from all the data I collected. Everyone already knows who's taking the number 1 spot, but number 2 is not Jaden Yuki. It's actually Reginald Shark Castle, who has a total of 28 support cards. What makes this even crazier is that just a few days after I finished collecting and analyzing the data, I was watching a video from Yu-Gi-Oh! Everything, where he reacted to a new Shark support card. He pointed out that we've gotten so much Shark support over the past few years, that it feels like someone at Konami must be a huge fan of Nash or Shark decks. And he was absolutely right. He even speculated that Shark might have received more support than Yuma himself. And it turns out that's exactly what happened. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Everything, you were definitely onto something. There's gotta be someone at Konami pushing hard for this support. And in the process, Shark has surpassed every other main antagonist, except for one. Looking at all the cards we've gotten over the past 5 years, there were, of course, some random one-off Shark cards spread across various sets. But more notably, Shark actually received 3 major waves of supports. The first wave came in a legendary duelist pack, Duels from the Deep, which was released in 2022. In the OCG, Nash was actually on the cover of the set, but in the TCG, Konami decided to swap him out for a Mako Tsunami instead. This wave leaned heavily into the Baryon side of Shark's deck, introducing new cards that supported his Baryon-based strategy. And while I personally think these cards were pretty cool, they weren't particularly well received by most players. And I guess Konami thought so too, because a year later Shark got their second wave of support in Age of Overlord, which took things in a completely different direction. Instead of continuing with Baryon cards, Konami introduced a brand new sub-archetype for Sharks, focused on the armored Xyz monsters. And most recently, in October of 2024, we've got the third wave of Shark support in Rage of the Abyss. With so much support, could Shark at this rate eventually catch up to the number 1 spot? Absolutely not. Because the number 1 is, of course, Yugi Moto with a whopping 66 support cards. More than the number 2 and 3 spots combined. I think most people who keep up with new card releases saw this coming. Yugi had to be the number 1. He's the poster child of the franchise, even after all these years. Within these last 5 years, we've seen consistent waves of Yugi support across multiple sets. Besides a couple of random cards here and there, we got a lot of Gaia the Fierce Knight support, primarily in Rise of the Duelists. About a year later in King's Court, the Arcana Knights received their first major wave of support, which, to be fair, definitely needed it. Additional Arcana Knight cards were also released across a few other sets afterward. A few months later in Brothers of Legend we got Kuribo support. Specifically the Kuribo cards Yugi used in Season 4. Konami definitely took their sweet time printing these. The next year in Battle of Chaos we saw another round of Dark Magician support. Then in Duelist Nexus, Konami introduced a brand new archetype based on Gazelle, Baphomet and Chimera the Flying Mythical Beasts. And most recently in Legacy of Destruction they created another brand new archetype, this time based on Little Yugi's deck from Season 5, Shining Sarcophagus. So yeah, 2 brand new archetypes and a ton of support for his older strategies easily makes Yugi the undisputed number 1 on this list. The only thing I went back and forth on was to whether to categorize the entire Chimera archetype as Yugi supports. The Gazelle, Baphomet and Nightmare Magician retrains are clearly tied to Yugi. But what about cards like Mirror Sword Knight and Cornfield Codal? These cards don't seem to have any direct connection to Yugi's original deck. Or at least, none that I could think of. Ultimately, I decided to count them as Yugi support, because they are all linked through Chimera Fusion and Chimera the Flying Mythical Beast. But honestly, I think this is open to interpretation. That said, even without counting those cards, Yugi is still leagues ahead of everyone else, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Now let's address the elephant, or should I say the mammoth, in the room. How is it that Jaden Yuki, arguably the second most popular main protagonist and the user of one of the most beloved archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh!, didn't even make the top 10? I've been thinking about making a video for each Yu-Gi-Oh! Series, ranking every character from that particular show and going into more detail on the data, as well as some of the categorization choices I had to make. But I don't want to wait for that video to address Jaden specifically. Jaden actually just missed the cut, coming in at spot 11, with 17 support cards tied with another character. And there are some logical reasons for this. While Yugi has a ton of one-off cards that eventually became full archetypes, Jaden's support is more spread out across multiple characters. All Elemental Hero and Neospatians counted as Jaden's supports. Destiny Hero cards were counted towards Aster Phoenix. Yubel was categorized separately, and she also got a ton of new support last year. The Supreme King was also treated as a separate character, so all Evil Hero support was counted under him, not Jaden. If we combine Jaden's 17 cards with just the 9 Evil Hero cards we got recently, that would put him at 26 support cards, placing him above Yuma and making him the third on the list, right below Shark. And if we also included Jubel's 10 support cards, Jaden would jump up to 36 total cards, making him the clear number 2 on this list. So if you would count all of those archetypes together under Jaden, he'd be miles ahead of everyone except Yugi. Ultimately, a lot of this comes down to personal interpretation of what counts as support for each character. So let me know your thoughts about the choices I made. I'll try to respond to as many comments as I can, and your feedback can help me catch any mistakes or refine the process for future videos. Who knows, maybe I can turn this into a yearly update, tracking how character support changes over time. Alright, now let's rank each Yu-Gi-Oh! Series based on how much support they received over the last 5 years. Coming in at number 6, with the least amount of support is Yu-Gi-Oh! VRAINS. Looking at all the support released for VRAINS, it actually seems like Konami did a decent job covering all the major characters from the series over the last 5 years. Spectre's deck was finally printed, Yusaku got enough support to crack the top 10, Soulburner received support in the Legendary Duelist pack, we've also seen new cards for Marincess, I, Rocket, Altergeist, and even G-Golem. Coming in at number 5 is Yu-Gi-Oh! ZEXAL. Even though ZEXAL had 3 characters in the top 10, including 2 in the top 3, that still wasn't enough to push the series past 5th place. Yuma, Shark and Kai did most of the heavy lifting when it came to the new support. Beyond these 3 main duelists, Konami finally got around printing Dawn 1000's deck in Battles of Legend Armageddon, Alito also finally received some love in the Fire Duelist pack, while Quattro's Gimmick Puppets got some degenerate FTK support last year. Taking the 4th spot is Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds. Overall, the main 3 duelists, Yusei, Jack and Crow, were pretty well represented in terms of new support. Yusei even made it in the top 10 characters list. Jack and Crow weren't too far behind either, both landing in the next tier of well-supported characters. Konami also finally printed Sherry's deck, giving her one of the most powerful boss monsters the game has ever seen. Akiza also received some new cards, but far less than Yusei, Jack or Crow, which is a bit disappointing. Even Leo ended up getting more support than Akiza. That said, it wasn't still as bad as Luna, who got a grand total of 1 support card over the last 5 years. Luckily, Konami is finally making up for that by giving Luna her very own archetype. We also finally got the Crimson Dragon as an actual card, along with support focused around it. Up next, beating out 5Ds by a pretty sizable margin, is Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. Overall, GX characters had a fantastic run over the last 5 years, with multiple decks and archetypes receiving long-awaited support. First, we got a Sacred Beast structure deck finally making Uriah, Raviel and Haman playable in modern-day Yu-Gi-Oh! Jim Crocodile Cook's Fossil cards were finally introduced to the TCG, a deck that fans have been asking for pretty much since the anime aired. Zane's Cyber Dragons got a major boost with a Cyber Strike structure deck, which focused on enhancing the Cyber Dark strategy. Destiny Hero support was limited. but they did get one of the best boss monsters in the game. Power of the Elements brought even more support for Jaden's Elemental Hero and Neospatians. Fan favorite Jesse Anderson got a brand new structure deck, introducing a new wave of Crystal Beast support. After so many years, Axel Brody's Volcanics finally got some new cards, bringing back what felt like a completely forgotten archetype. Crowler's Ancient Gears got a massive upgrade, even seeing some raw competitive play at various events. In the most recent set, the Supreme King's Evil Hero deck finally got some long-awaited upgrades. And last but not least, Yubel received a huge amount of new support, and the deck even won a TCG-OCG World Championship. Now for the number 2 slot, and with that we also reveal the winner of this ranking, and number 2 is Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 with a total of 175 support cards, which means of course that the original Yu-Gi-Oh! Takes a number 1 spot, with 203 support cards. But what really surprised me about this ranking is that Duel Monsters isn't actually that far ahead of Arc 5. In fact, as I continue digging into the data, I think there may have been moments where Arc 5 briefly overtook Duel Monsters in terms of support. Another interesting trend is how this ranking almost follows the release order of the shows. The only exception is Arc 5 surpassing ZEXAL, 5Ds and even Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. Which raises the question, is Arc 5 way more popular than we realize? Well, I don't have the answer to that. But one key reason I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Arc 5 is so high on this list is because of its massive cast of characters. The main protagonist and main female lead are essentially split up into 4 different versions, each with their own deck and archetype. And as you'd expect, that adds up very quickly. But even beyond that, Arc 5 simply has a huge number of characters, leading up to a wide variety of supported archetypes. Here are a few key highlights from Arc 5's support over the last 5 years. Zark finally received enough support to make it a playable strategy on its own. Gong Strong's Super Heavy Samurai deck got so much good support that the TCG had to ban its Link monster almost immediately, and the deck even terrorized Master Duel for months. Shay's Raid Raptors received new support, including the second ranked 13 monster ever created, and the deck even saw some raw competitive play. Yugo got 2 waves of support, one in Legendary Duelist Synchro Storm and another in Supreme Darkness. Yuri's Predaplans received support in Dimension Force, released alongside a lot of Yuya's cards. Melodious finally got its long-awaited upgrades, seamlessly incorporating pendulum mechanics into the strategy, and even seeing some play at competitive events. But in the end, even all of that wasn't enough to surpass the OG Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters. We already went over Yugi, Kaiba and Joey support since they made the top 10, but there's so much more that was released over the last 5 years. Here are some of the biggest highlights, because honestly, there's just too much to cover it in detail. Pegasus got new Toon support in Toon Chaos. Mira received a wave of support for his Egyptian god, the Winged Dragon of Ra. Mako Tsunami essentially got an entirely new deck, with retrains of his classic monsters. The Gate Guardians finally got support, turning them into a playable strategy that pays homage to their Duelist Kingdom playstyle. Grandpa Modo got a modernized version of his Exodia deck, packed with a lot of cool Easter eggs referencing the final arc of the original series. And just late last year, Konami introduced an entirely new archetype based around a retrain of Metal Morph, paying homage to the iconic duel between Joey and Bandit Keith. Overall, I think Konami's been doing a great job lately when it comes to creating nostalgic archetypes from the original show and making them playable in the modern era. At the same time, they still managed to tie everything back to the anime in a meaningful way. Okay, before we jump into the most interesting stat in this video, how much anime-inspired support we're actually getting compared to other archetypes, I want to quickly mention one more character that deserves some support. Me. This video took weeks of collecting, analyzing and organizing all this data. Not to mention putting it all together into something watchable. So if you enjoy these data-driven analysis videos, let me know by liking, subscribing and leaving a comment. And since I'm already diving deep into Yu-Gi-Oh! Trends and data, tell me what kind of analysis videos you would like to see next. I've already got some exciting ideas, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Alright, after crunching the numbers, I found that the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG released a total of 2,855 new cards during the period I analyzed. Out of those, I classified 895 cards as anime support, which means that anime-related cards make up around 31.35% of all new releases. Almost a third of what we're getting can be linked to one of the 6 main Yu-Gi-Oh! Series. That also means that about 2/3, or nearly 70%, of all new cards are entirely original, introducing brand new archetypes, new strategies, and new upgrades to existing non-anime archetypes. So after analyzing all this data, it turns out that anime support is still a huge part of Yu-Gi-Oh! But the majority of new cards are still entirely original. Now I want to hear from you. Does this data match what you expected? Or are there any surprises that stood out to you? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on future Yu-Gi-Oh! Analysis videos, because I already have some more ideas in the works. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.